Donald Trump has completely lost it. No self-respecting Western leader takes him seriously anymore, especially after he made a mockery of the Davos Forum. No one in his right mind should trust the guy. Hi, I'm Daniel Seaman, and you're watching Straight Up from the JNS TV studios here in Jerusalem, Israel. Well, now that I grabbed your attention with the headline, hang in there with me, because today I'm going to cut through all the media noise with you and show you how the media manipulates us and what is really going on. Here are some of the questions raised this week about the political events going on. Has Donald Trump betrayed the people of Iran? Are the US and Israel on the verge of a major falling out over Gaza? Is the Netanyahu-Trump bromance collapsing? And has Donald Trump lost his mind? If your source for information on these is the Western media or those Israeli commentators echoing them, then you'd probably think that the answer to these questions is yes. And you probably would not be wrong. Because we in the West have all been programmed for immediate gratification, both by our consumer societies and by how our media operates. But life itself is a bit more complicated than the headlines we read, and much more is happening behind the scenes. Things that the media don't want to bring to light or even want to delve in. The reason for this is threefold. First, the media have a narrative they promote. The media prefer a dramatic storyline over an accurate one, just like the headlines I opened up with. And facts that don't fit the narrative are omitted. Second, there is political motivation behind the way most media reports, and these outlets have every incentive to frame events in a particular way that fits with or even better complements their political worldview. Third, and mainly, it's because most of the members of the mainstream media reporting from here and covering this region, as well as many of their Israeli counterparts, simply don't understand what they're talking about. Or to be more blunt about it, many of them are just idiots. I worked with them for years. I was shocked and disappointed at how little many of them knew and understood, even when confronted with facts that tore apart the core of what they believed to be the truth. Before getting into the depth of the issues raised, I want to address the comments I opened up with. Now would be a good time for all the Trump haters and the Israel haters to turn off and leave, because you're not going to like what I have to say today. Because just like the pathetic leaders of Western Europe at the Davos Forum Convention, whatever the hell it is, those who have refused Trump's offer to join the new Peace Council, you too have been proven to be too stupid to understand what is really going on. Trump is a generational leader. I would say on the scale of Lincoln, but to be honest, there's no comparison. He is setting a new standard, just like Netanyahu is doing as a leader of the Jewish people. They are both changing the way our thinking in the West has been formatted. I talked about this in a previous podcast. We should not then be surprised by how leaders in the West have reacted to him. If any of them, now or for the past 60 years, showed an inkling of the disdain that they are expressing towards him, towards those same brutal dictators and murderous terrorist leaders, the world would have been in a different place now. But they are standing up to him. Wow, how brave and how heroic of them. The world is going to be a different place because of Trump. The media will tell you, look at all those who are falling in line behind Trump. They are the despots, they are dictators. Yes, they're right, because these are the leaders who know what power is. They have that primal survival instinct that is lost on the Europeans, who are just that, lost. Trump is giving the Europeans a chance, offering them to get behind him and save their butts and their nations, but they're just too caught up in their usual virtue signaling. The media will tell you Trump is destroying the UN out of spite because of what happened last September. You remember when he arrived at the United Nations and the escalator suddenly didn't work, and then when he was reading out his speech, suddenly it didn't work for him? That pathetic organization did not do this to Donald Trump. They did it to the President of the United States of America, the same country hosting them and funding most of their corrupt activities. They would never dare do such a thing to any of the dictators or the terrorists they cater to. So Donald Trump is speaking clearly and carrying a big stick and stressing that the buck stops here, now, telling the world it has nothing to fear but fear the United States because the American people have had enough. Donald Trump is the leader of the world and advancing his strategy and the interests of the United States. He understands that countries have their own interests and is showing that he respects that, as long as these countries don't cross a line. Netanyahu is the leader of Israel. We also have our interests. Donald Trump respects that, and he understands that, as I mentioned. There is no falling out between them. Not only Donald Trump and Netanyahu advance their own interests, every single leader in the world advances what they believe to be the interests of their own countries. I'll give credit to Trump, who as a good businessman is trying to make this effort fit the interests of all involved, and that they perceive it as such, meaning that it's not only what he wants, but they believe that it's something that is to the benefit of their countries. The U.S. administration this week announced that they are creating a peace committee to help run Gaza. It is a project that is in motion. There's still going to be a lot of changes. One headline read, Israel blocks entry of committee met to run Gaza under Trump plan, Palestinians say. This was the headline of Haaretz this week. Good to see that Haaretz publishes for the enemies of Israel. Yes, Israel has a problem with Qatar and Turkey being involved in the disarming of Hamas in Gaza and creating conditions for the reconstruction of Gaza. The media omits the facts that Qatar and Turkey were the primary funders of Hamas and hosted them in their countries, and even granting them refugee status after the massacre of October 7th. But Israel has a bigger problem with the whole concept of international guarantors. Which brings us to another point that almost no one outside of Israel understands. Certainly not the diplomats, the think tankers, or the editorial boards calling for an international force to take over Gaza. Israel has been down that road before, and it has never ended well. Israel has a long, painful record with foreign forces who were supposedly sent here to maintain security. This is done because Western media has always projected Israel's military doctrine as somehow extreme, unusual, or morally suspect. But when you compare Israel's strategic logic to how other democracies have explained their own wars, there's no difference. Democracies don't go to war casually. They go to war when they believe they have no choice, when the threat is existential, when civilians are targeted, when the enemy's ideology leaves no room for coexistence. And when that moment comes, when faced with existential danger, democracies act with moral clarity and strategic decisiveness. This is exactly what Israel is doing now. Israel's doctrine, overwhelming force against an enemy that targets civilians, the insistence on decisive victory, the refusal to tolerate a genocidal threat on its borders, is exactly how democracies behave when confronted with actors who reject the basic norms of coexistence. Other democracies are allowed to defend themselves. Israel is expected to absorb the blow, negotiate with the attacker, and apologize for surviving. But historically, democracies have never operated that way. Israel is the only democracy to fight an existential war under a global microscope that actively distorts its motives, its actions, and even its right to defend itself. A distortion which is deliberate and malicious. The media doesn't frame Israel the way it frames other democracies, because Israel's enemies have mastered something no previous adversary has ever had: the ability to shape the narrative faster than the facts can be verified. They weaponize imagery, social media, influencers, and emotional manipulation at the scale that overwhelms traditional journalism. Meanwhile, Hezbollah was digging bunkers literally dozens of meters from the positions of the United Nations forces, and they didn't lift a finger. Why? Because they knew that the IDF would never attack them, because they knew that Israel plays by the rules, and because some of these countries, France included, were more interested in signaling political hostility than in stopping terrorism. So when people talk about sending a multinational force into Gaza, we know that the reality will be very different from what the West is thinking and offering. Such a force will, and has always been the case, restrict Israel's ability to defend itself. The nations involved will file false reports accusing Israel of violating ceasefires, and blame Israel for every time the Hamas fires a shot in our direction. At best, the presence of an international force ties our hands, and in the worst case, it ends up cooperating with the very terror groups that we're fighting against. It has all happened before, and the Israeli public have had enough of this. This is another example of the global misunderstanding which is at the heart of the conflict. The belief that Israel can outsource its security to people who don't share its risks, don't understand the reality, and don't pay the price when things go wrong. Israelis know better. We've lived the consequences of this. Anyone thinks that Gaza can simply be handed over to some neutral, professional, apolitical, technocratic committee, as they call it, as if this is where some Scandinavian municipal council stepping up to manage recycling or zoning laws, they're not naive. They are lying. Over the weekend, this so-called Technocrats Committee was unveiled and immediately marketed to the world as a group of independent Palestinians with no organizational ties, a clean break from Hamas, a fresh start, a responsible governing body, except that it isn't. Omri Chaim of Israel Channel 14 took a look at who actually is sitting on the committee and reports that these are not neutral administrators. These are people who, over the years, have met with senior Hamas officials, praised terrorists who murdered Israelis, and openly embraced the violent fantasy of the right of return. Several of these have previously met with Hamas leadership in Gaza, this according to Arab media reports, and the meeting focused on cooperation between the various Palestinian resistance movements on all national issues. This is the group the world is now presenting as neutral alternatives to Hamas. This is exactly the kind of misunderstanding or willful blindness that Israel keeps warning about. The West keeps searching for a technocratic solution, a managerial fix, a committee that can magically stabilize Gaza. But the people being put forward are not neutral, not independent, and not committed to peace. They are part of the same ideological ecosystem that produced Hamas in the first place. They're not pragmatic, not realistic, and certainly not neutral. The Trump Peace Council has a greater goal. It is not just about Gaza and the Middle East post-October 7th war. It is part of the new world order that he is developing. That is the bigger picture. And that is why the disagreement with Israel is semantic and less important. Israel is not opposed to the idea. It just wants Trump's plans to address not only the concerns, but also not to repeat the mistakes that we experience of the old world order's failures. The mainstream media keep trying to read political behavior, especially American political behavior, through the old diplomatic playbook. Predictable processes, predictable language, predictable outcomes. But the world doesn't work like that anymore. Israeli commentator Meir Alush touches exactly on that with a post he wrote this week. Alush makes a point that cuts straight through the noise. What looks like chaos in Donald Trump's behavior is actually a method, a strategy, a deliberate refusal to let anyone, allies as well as enemies, predict his next move. He compares it to the meme, "Never let them know your next move." He shows how Trump's unpredictability on issues such as Greenland, Venezuela, and Iran wasn't random at all. It is controlled ambiguity, a way of forcing everyone around him to stop, hesitate, and rethink their assumptions. Alush describes this as leverage, not instability. In a world built on rigid diplomatic scripts, Trump's refusal to play by the script becomes a tool. It prevents others from boxing him in. It keeps adversaries off balance. And it forces allies to think twice before assuming that they know where he's heading. Alush's insight is simple but powerful. This isn't chaos, it's control. And for Trump, it works. And I quote, "like a cool breeze over the soil of Greenland." And Alush continues, "This matters for us right now because if you're trying to understand the current Israel-US dynamic through the lens of traditional diplomacy, you're going to get it all wrong. The media gets it wrong every day. But when you look at it through the lens that Alush describes, unpredictability as strategy, suddenly the picture becomes a lot clearer." Talking about a clearer picture, while all this is happening, the calls for international forces, the double standards applied to Israel, the way every Israeli action is scrutinized under a microscope, while the actions of our enemies are blurred out of the frame, Israel and the Jewish people are facing another old front. One from long before the current war, long before the latest diplomatic drama. It is all part of how the world perceives Jews altogether. It's the hatred of the Jews that has been on the rise around the world right now. Israeli journalist Eldad Beck, who I've interviewed several times on the podcast here, addresses the issue in an article he wrote this week, asking why does anti-Semitism surprise us every time it resurfaces? For a very simple reason, he writes, we treat it dismissively, as if it were an illness that can be cured with some kind of medicine, something we can fight and defeat. Anti-Semitism is indeed a disease, he says, but it cannot be defeated. That does not mean we should not fight it, because as long as there are Jews in the world, there will be anti-Semitism. The current wave of this disease is unprecedented in its global scope, and it is far from reaching its peak. Eldad Beck continues, why does anti-Semitism surprise us? Because every time it weakens, we convince ourselves that the world has learned its lessons from the horrific consequences of this disease, and that the Jewish blood spilled because of it has finally changed the attitude of the non-Jews toward the Jews. Israel, which was established to allow Jews to live without the anti-Semitism of the surrounding societies, under the assumption that this would solve the problem of anti-Semitism, has developed a habit of treating anti-Semitism lightly, as if the very existence of Israel means anti-Semitism no longer exists. He says that the education system here does not teach what anti-Semitism actually is, that the media in Israel ignores the true dimensions of the phenomena, and remembers it only when outbreaks become impossible to avoid reporting. He says that in the major media outlets where he worked, he was repeatedly asked to stop dealing with anti-Semitism and to focus instead on trivial anecdotes. Certain Israeli politicians never rest in their efforts to trivialize anti-Semitism or erase entirely the issue of Arab anti-Semitism in order to promote their delusion of peace agendas. Even state institutions that are supposed to raise awareness of anti-Semitism betray their mission. We remember to fight anti-Semitism only when it is already too late, and then we wonder how we failed to see what was unfolding before our very eyes. Eldad Beck lays out the last 6 years as a case study in our blindness. During COVID, Jews were blamed for creating the virus and then for creating the vaccine. During the Russia-Ukraine war, Jews were blamed for supporting Putin and then for supporting Zelensky. And after October 7th, the most dangerous wave of all began. The one that flips victim and aggressor instantly. The one that recycles Nazi ideology and applies it to the largest Jewish community on earth, the Jews of Israel. This wave, he warns, isn't just about hatred. It is about our elimination. And the pattern is chillingly familiar. It follows the script written by the Nazis. Criminalize and demonize the Jewish state. Isolate it through boycotts and exclusion. Normalize the idea that its destruction is justified. And once Israel falls, the logic goes, the rest of the world's Jews will be easier to deal with. So why are we surprised every time? Because we underestimate anti-Semitism. We treat it as something that can be defeated instead of something that must be contained, anticipated, and prepared for. And Eldad Beck's warning is clear. We are very good at firefighting after the blaze has already begun. We are terrible at building fireproof walls before the match is even struck. So, I'll leave you with that thought, and hopefully with greater insights of all that is taking place around us. I'll be with you again next time on Straight Up, here from the JNS TV studios in Jerusalem. I'm Daniel Seaman. Thank you for watching.